Today we're going to be talking about what astrophysicist and science writer Lawrence Krauss calls the war on science. That's the title of a new book of essays he's edited, featuring 39 well-known scientists and scholars, many of them regular Quillette contributors, who are all concerned that progressive ideological actors are compromising the pursuit of scientific truth by placing constraints on who can become a scientist and what those scientists are allowed to say and study. Many of these writers describe illiberal and heavy-handed university administrators who, in some cases, have sought to investigate and punish academics at their schools merely for questioning policies such as affirmative action and anti-racism training. Authors in the book include Richard Dawkins, whose lengthy essay describes the persistent campaign to suppress plain truths about the differences between the two human sexes, males and females. Sally Satel, who writes about the unsettling ways in which DEI and related doctrines are undermining the integrity of medical school curricula. And Steven Pinker, who offers a 5-point plan for saving universities from all of the problems described by the other authors. We'll also talk about the threat to scientific inquiry coming from the opposite side of the political spectrum. While Krauss's book was published just a few months ago, the essays it contains were written and edited in late 2024, just as Donald Trump was preparing for his second term as US president. As listeners know, Trump has since stripped science research funding from universities and a number of government agencies, and many of his political appointees have advanced extremely dubious theories in regard to important scientific subjects, such as global warming and vaccines. This suggests that if there is indeed a war on science, it might be one that we have to wage on two fronts. Please enjoy my interview with theoretical physicist and cosmologist Lawrence Krauss about his latest book project titled The War on Science. 39 renowned scientists and scholars speak out about current threats to free speech, open inquiry, and the scientific process. And one final note for those watching on video. I caught Lawrence just as he was making the move from the United States back to Canada, and as you'll see from the video, his new home is in a little bit of disarray, with boxes and personal effects strewn about. That's not a reflection of Lawrence's housekeeping, but the awkward timing of the interview. Thanks for your understanding. Lawrence Krauss, thanks for joining the Quillette podcast.
It's great to be with you virtually, Jonathan.
Now, I know that your background is in the hard sciences, astrophysics. In some ways, maybe you're an improbable person to organize this kind of project because your average listener would think at that highly technical extreme of the hard sciences, you would be insulated from some of the ideological trends you talk about and that your authors talk about in the book. So could you tell us a little how you, of all people, came to this project?
Well, I can, but I could also say, I'll jump ahead and say we're living in times when a meeting in Penn State on the search for extraterrestrial intelligence and astrophysics in principle topic decided that they wanted to change that and get rid of the word intelligence because it was a white supremacist concept. Okay. Or in Canada, the Canadian government funded a major grant called Decolonizing Light.
At Concordia.
Yeah, Concordia. And as if somehow, because light was somehow developed by Faraday and Maxwell, it must be.
Although, in defense, by the way, light, as you know, there's a particle theory of light and a wave theory of light. So light is literally two-spirited.
I hadn't thought of that. I hadn't.
Yeah.
There you go. I think you've got a career ahead of you there. Let me step back and say how I got involved in this. As I described in the introduction of the book, which I will pick up since it's in a book and all that stuff.
Oh, wow. That would make a great gift.
Yeah, it would make a great Christmas gift for every relative you have. It'll really
Hanukkah, Kwanzaa, yeah.
It's an uplifting book. But anyway, when I taught at Yale in the 80s and 90s, we lived on the physics department was on a thing called Science Hill, which most Yale students never actually made it up to. But we used to just laugh down at the English department because that was the heyday of deconstructionism.
I did engineering at McGill, and then I studied at Yale for a little bit. And the tradition of the hard sciences and engineering types turning their nose up at the liberal arts is a long and hallowed tradition that extends well beyond the era of deconstruction. So, I mean,
Absolutely, you're right. And we always, this sense of superiority, which is,
which is accurate.
okay, you said it. I mean, anyway, but it was really clear. We used to laugh because we said it couldn't happen here, and then Alan Sokol, who was one of the authors in the book, wrote this incredible spoof, which may have been before your time. I'm not
It was
sure.
1996.
Yes, were you even born
What do you
then?
mean before my time? You think I was born like when Jean Chrétien was prime minister or something?
Anyway, and it was a big spoof because it was the hermeneutics of quantum gravity. I don't even want to bother with the title. It was a complete gobbledygook because it basically said there's no such thing as objective knowledge, and it's all power structures, and quantum gravity somehow, it reveals this, and it was just balderdash. But then you fast forward 30 years, and you begin to see this stuff in science journals and in hard science journals, and even in my own hallowed field of physics, which I had hoped was impermeable in that regard. And the American Physical Society published an article on whiteness, the inherent whiteness in physics, arguing that whiteboards were an example of white supremacy. So I started to see this, but what really caused me to, and I thought of writing the book myself, but I'll tell you why I decided not to. What really hit me was when I wrote a piece, I began to get disturbed by this stuff, and I wasn't an early comer to this, so probably 2020. There are a lot of people who recognize it happening a lot earlier than me. But I wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal called The Ideological Corruption of Science. And I got feedback. I got letters from scientists around the country. And what was interesting was these are people I didn't know. All of them wrote from their home email server and not the university server. But at least 4 of them said they were writing under an assumed name because they were worried their colleagues or their administrators would learn that they agreed with me. Now, I mean, that's straight out of my childhood in Russia or East Berlin or Hungary. Academia should be the last place where people are afraid to express their views. And that really hit me that there's something really serious when academics are afraid of speaking out, or even agreeing with someone over an email because for fear that their email might be found out and their careers would end. That's the point where we all have to worry, because certainly not just scientific progress, but progress in all scholarship requires that kind of open debate and inquiry. And without it, we're lost. And so, I thought, okay, I want to write a book on this. And I thought, well, I can write a book on it, but then it'll be, I'm a physicist and, it'll be tainted with my politics, left or right. And I thought, well, I also began to think, how can we end this, or at least combat it? And the more I thought about it, most academics keep their head down and try and go below the radar and not worry about it. So it's fair to say, I think, in spite of being colored by the Trump administration or other people, as the whole all of academia is woke and lost. It's not. It's in sciences. Most people, I think most of my colleagues probably, for a while, used to think it was just okay, kind of silly, but they would just keep their heads down and not talk about it. There are others who didn't realize how pervasive and dangerous it was, because academic leaders are not leaders, and they're not academics anymore. They're usually failed academics. But how can you end this at universities? Well, academic leaders can start talking about academic integrity and free speech, except they don't. They're professional fundraisers. University presidents and other people have no backbone. And when social media, when someone criticizes some professor for speaking out about indigenous issues or something like that, what you find is that the university, the leaders of scientific leaders of institutions who should be defending this as a core principle, basically cave in and virtue signal and decide that they would rather end that. They're afraid of that mob, and they'd rather, we can just dispense with that faculty member. That's not important. And so if they're not going to do it, how's it going to change? Well, it's only going to change if academics themselves start speaking out. And I'm almost finished answering your question, but basically I said, how can we do that? Well, if I could get a set of, a large number of this relatively distinguished people, and it had to my selection set included a variety of things. First of all, it had to be diverse, but not in the sense that people, that DEI people are talking about. I wanted to get people from a whole bunch of disciplines to show that this isn't just endemic in physics or in English, and they had to be people from the inside. Because you see a lot of people attacking universities from the outside, and that's a right-wing attack, etc. There had to be people who were involved. And I wanted to get people with a diverse spectrum of well-known political interests. So people from the left, like Steve Pinker, and say Richard Dawkins, people from the right, like Jordan Peterson. So it couldn't so easily be tainted as a right-wing attack on science as I thought it might be. Of course, it has been by many people anyway, because I also believe in academic freedom. I didn't tell them what to write. I said, you write whatever you think is important about this issue, and I'll try and edit it and see if it comes together in a volume. And it did very well. And I was surprised and pleased. It was kind of like herding cats, of course. But I thought if people can see these people speaking out, especially academics, then that might help. And the other group that you have to convince is a problem is the public, because they're ultimately funding universities one way or another. And so anyway, that was the genesis of this whole volume.
I think it's great that you have 39 authors. That's a lot. It really is a mixed bag, though. You have Richard Dawkins. I'm going to object on his behalf to be called, relatively famous. He's he's at the top of the heap in terms of name recognition. But then you have others who are famous people. They're not really what I would call scientists. You have Godsad, very much a social critic, very prominent on social media, brilliant guy, I'm sure. He's not really known now as a scientist. Jordan Peterson, a huge following. Again, would I call him a scientist? Probably not. Like, were you worried that putting Richard Dawkins, whose lengthy essay, which is almost like a book, is I consider the highlight of your volume, to put him in between two covers with some folks who are basically culture warriors? Were you worried that that was going to make it easier for critics to tee off on this?
First of all, I knew the critics would find a reason to tee off on it no matter what. Okay. Secondly, if you want to get people to read serious issues, it was same when I do public events. What you have to do is get them in the seats. You have to get them to pick up the book. And so I recognize that when I was thinking of academics, and these were all academics, I repeat, but some people who are much more well known as culture warriors, or at least have a public following that's very large, that their public following would attract people to begin to read what was actually happening. So I wanted to get people who I knew were vitally concerned about the issue. Because if you're going to write a piece for this volume, and of the 39 essays, I think I told you, some 32 or 33 are original. The other ones are reworked. So I wanted to think about people who were willing to spend the time. And I was really impressed with the time, you're right, that Richard spent on that. But I thought, academia is all types. And I think we're trying to get the public to read this and learn what's going on. Jordan Peterson had a huge following, and Gad has a following in a different way. And I thought that this would attract those sets of people. I cast a broad net, and there were a number of people who were really interested. I will tell you, there were some people who were really interested, but couldn't spend the time. There were other people who were very interested, but felt that they were afraid to put their name on it. Okay. And there were a number of people I really wanted to get on and I understood their arguments.
Can you give us a hint of who they were?
No, I won't.
Like spell their name backwards or a riddle,
Oh, but for a large amount of money, I'll tell you privately. So I cast around to people I knew and said, who's writing interesting things about this, or who's thinking about interesting things about this? And it was fascinating for me because I didn't know a number of these people. And it was amazing to me when I did meet them or learn about them, that how well it meshed. I also, for example, didn't know that there were 3 husband and wife teams. I contacted people individually without realizing they were even spouses. And that shows where I was at. But once I started to get people, I did work to try and get people in different disciplines.
Very few engineers, by the way, or maybe no engineers.
There are no engineers.
I say this with pride. Relative to the other disciplines, does that mean that my discipline, engineering, has been relatively protected from this phenomenon?
No. I wrote a piece, and frankly, it may have even been for Quillette, John, about an engineering school in Holland that specifically decided that they would not hire any males for 5 years.
Let's get to that, because you call your book The War on Science. I kind of like the title that you had on your Wall Street Journal piece, which was The Corruption of Science, because if you talk to the people who, the administrators, the DEI apparatchiks, the department chair people,
Yeah.
the hiring committees, they're going to say, we love science. The last thing we want to wage war on is science. We are in favor of inclusive excellence. We want to include the greatest number of fine minds in our discipline, which till now have been excluded because of sexism and racism and so forth. And nothing could be further from the truth that we are waging a war on science. We are waging a war on the exclusionary methods that have resulted in our department being 70% male, 80% male. And by the way, astrophysics, despite the best efforts of all these DEI crews, astrophysics, got to admit, even now, mostly male. A lot of these essays are about the institutional response to people who criticize DEI or who uphold the merit principle. What do you say to the people who say our attack on traditional hiring and promotion methods is about improving science by empowering as many voices as possible?
Well, I think, look, I guess I say in the end that the road to hell is paved with good invention.
These aren't evil people, right? They're
Oh,
people.
no. And I think most people think that they're doing good, even. But here's the thing. I was chairman of a physics department for 15 years. And I was very happy that the first 2 female faculty members got hired when I was there. And so 30 years ago, if I hired a faculty member who wasn't female, we had to fill out a special set of forms explaining why and justifying how we possibly made that hire. So that was 30 years ago. This is not new. And this effort to try and broaden the demographic in the sciences goes back a long way. And bottom line is, it hasn't made much difference. First of all,
No, that's
come
not true.
around to
Wait.
thinking,
No. I'm not going to let you get away with that.
you know what? When that engineering school, listen to me, when that engineering school said it wouldn't hire, any males, the number of women in the school went up from 25% to 27%. Okay. Now, bottom line is also, if you look at the countries that are most gender equal, if you want to think of it that way, say Scandinavian countries, what you find out is, so they're the least, you might say that there are barriers to people entering, to women entering science. And, but first of all, if you say that, you have to show it. But anyway, you might presume that those barriers are the least in the Nordic countries. There's the largest gender difference in the sciences between the sexes. So to assume a demographic difference results from barriers of discrimination is an assumption. And I'm telling you that from my experience as a scientist, and I think as an administrator for a while, is that there are no such barriers. In fact, it's quite the opposite. It is quite the opposite, and it's been that way for a long time. And one of the writers in here, Anna Krylov, who's a chemist, has said that her male graduate students just give up. They don't even try going to academia, and they know they'll not get a job. And I have the same thing with my postdocs.
Because of the academic hiring restrictions.
Yes. And in Canada, of course, it's more extreme. As you know, as I talk about, there's legalized discrimination in Canada, which is, I mean, to me, Bruce Party wrote a neat essay. There's a essay about the law in the piece and in the book. And I can't believe this ridiculous Supreme Court of Canada decision. It was before I moved back to Canada. But basically it said, yes, 2 wrongs make a right. Okay. So if people have been discriminated against in the past, it's okay to discriminate against other people now. I mean, it's just a completely irrational argument. And I have come around to thinking that affirmative action, even at the time, there were problems with affirmative action because it puts an asterisk next to your name. And I know many incredibly accomplished and talented female scientists who agree with me on this, that if there's special hiring for a certain identity group, then everyone who's then hired that has that identity is tainted by the possibility they were hired not for their ability, but because of their sex or their color of their skin or something else. For a long time, that people talk about manals. So I have a friend of mine, and I'll mention his name, Brian Schmidt, who's won the Nobel Prize. He was the president of the University, Australian National University, which I worked at for a while, but I've known him for a long time. He announced he would not appear on any panels that are only men. But I know a lot of women who will not appear on panels when they're told that they have to be, that they're there to be a woman on the panel, because it's insulting to them. And the other thing about affirmative action is it doesn't help in many other ways. Let's take in the case of race.
But Lawrence, I don't want to turn this into a conversation about affirmative action, because we're not going to solve.
No, but I'm just saying, if you were, look, to recognize that there are real inequities in society, to argue that there aren't is ridiculous. There are real inequities in society. Where can you address them? The last place to address them is a tenured professorship at a university. The best place to address them is to go into the public schools. And so almost always, when you look at the affirmative action efforts, you're ending up giving a leg up to people who already don't need it, who've already gone to the best universities, and so the problem is it began with good intentions. People like me and other people, left-leaning people, I would say, wanted to try and make things as inclusive as possible. And it's a nice idea, but then it got perverted. So that diversity, equity, and inclusion, which all are words that sound good, and still there's some academics think, how can you be against them? Inclusion becomes exclusion. Equity becomes equal outcomes, not equal opportunity. So that's, of course, an anathema to science, because science, all of academia should be a meritocracy. It should be a democracy. It won't proceed unless you allow the best to succeed and support them. And so requiring equal outcomes is just ridiculous.
I agree with a lot of what you're saying, but although some of these linguistic issues have been litigated to death in the last couple of years, so let's move on. I just want to come back to the germ of truth at the core of this. I'm not as old as the hills. I'm only in my 50s, but I have a contemporary. She's a little older. She's the older sister of someone who was my friend in Montreal. She was the first woman, the only woman in a particular engineering department at McGill University. And this isn't like the 1930s, 1940s. This is like maybe the late 1970s. There was no woman's bathroom in this particular engineering building. This person, again, they're probably in their 60s now, the age when a person, would still be teaching. This isn't ancient history. There have been old boys networks, and presumably there's still old boys networks still running in a lot of scientific institutions, no?
There may be, but you're still talking 50 years ago after a concerted effort to try and change that. The past is the past, and we have to ask what remnants of the past are still here. And if we claim that nothing has changed, I think we need to provide some evidence of that. And everything has changed especially about gender in science. And look at it this way. Let's look at the demographics in universities. Right now, universities students are 60% female and 40% male. Males are not going to university. That's across the spectrum in all fields, in the United States and in Canada, North America, and generally across the West. And in fact, it's true not just at the undergraduate level. It's true all the way up, if you average over all fields, to the PhD level. And, I'll get in trouble for this, but it's true. At least it's true if you look at the data, that people actually choose the field they go into based on what they like to do. And it seems to be based on people who are able to march with their feet rather than where they're told to go, that you tend to find more females are interested in the biological sciences. And so they're by far dominated by females. If you look at a specific field, and physics is one, and engineering maybe another, you'll find out that right now they're male dominated. But you have to ask, so what? Okay. And then you have to ask the question why, and then you have to do some research to see if there's an answer. And as far as I can see, the argument that there's some systemic, and this is the key point, it's claimed to be systemic. That means the institution is effectively and actively ensuring that these people aren't hired. And that's obvious nonsense. And then you get people like, and I talk about it, Francis Collins in the book, claiming after George Floyd that biomedical sciences are systemically racist. What a ridiculous statement. He was the head of the National Institutes of Health.
Okay, but Lawrence, let me interrupt you there. That is ridiculous. But a lot of the most ridiculous examples that are cited by the authors in your book, there's a huge uptick of this in the social panic that surrounded the murder of George Floyd.
Yeah, there certainly was.
And how much of this war on science crested during that period, 2020, 2021, 2022, which also, by the way, corresponded to the high point of this like quasi-religious, super weird phenomenon where it was imagined that men could become women by changing their pronouns. It was like a kind of alchemy where, lead could become gold if you said the right magic spell. Popular Science magazine wrote articles, I think 2019, giving credence to this nonsense. But like, we haven't seen a lot of that in the last year or two. How much of the content of this book is responding to a social panic that crested a couple of years ago? The war on science, there's been an effective counterattack, led in part by people like you and people whose names appear in the book. Is it accurate to say that we all have to man the barricades now? We've been manning the barricades. Quillette, a lot of Quillette authors have been doing so. And that a lot of this nonsense, we're in the process of beating it back, no?
I wish I could agree with you. Well, we are in the process of beating it back a little bit, but to claim that it's over is just ridiculous.
It's not over, especially in Canada. It's not over, but in the
It's
United States,
not over in Canada. It's not over in, I hear examples at all times. And one of the few things I lauded about the early Trump administration was an executive order about funding of DEI stuff specifically. Of course, the problem with that is that they overreact. They think all science is woke and will kill all science. But I think it was it may have been in Quillette where we just last year we did a survey of NSF grants. Okay, and 12% of the grants to fund science, which is and NSF had been cut 8%. 12% of it was just purely DEI stuff, nothing to do with science.
a grant to study the number of like black women and such.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you could look at you could just look at it and it had nothing to do with actual science, nothing to do with the stuff the NSF is mandated to study. And you also have these entrenched bureaucracies. And this began before George Floyd, and it's continuing, and it just got stronger and stronger. You remember you have a whole group of people who couldn't get their jobs unless they did a loyalty oath. And more than you couldn't just say, I'm not gonna distinguish people on the basis of the skin color. That wouldn't get you through. You have to show how you were actively anti-racist. You have a whole cohort of people who've been hired based on that. Some of them did it because they wanted to get the job and they just figured, they took Chat GPT or something else and said, write me something. But you've got a whole bunch of true believers who are involved. Look, the American Physical Society, let me just take my own example. Just after you claim that this peak wokeness is gone, they've created a new office of ethics and everything else, and they now have someone who's involved with psychological safety.
Have you applied?
No. This person's already there, a professional DI person, but psychological safety. Now, I have to say, who said you're supposed to feel psychologically safe if you're doing science? Probably most scientists don't, because it's a very competitive field. And when I was at Harvard, I had a really nice job, but I knew if there were a lot of other good people around beside me, and I had to work damn hard, and I never felt psychologically safe. And who says, what does even psychological safety mean? And so the notion that somehow you're never supposed to be inconvenienced or hurt or offended I can tell you, still permeates academia. And
Okay.
the real extremes, you're right. If you look at it, there was a peak at 2021 and it's going down slowly, but it's a long tail. And if we just ignore it, once this current backlash against it goes away, you're still getting people who are afraid to speak. And I think a recent survey still, FIRE may have done it, of students and faculty asking if they feel free to say what they think in university. A significant fraction, and sometimes the majority, say no. And as long as that's the case, scholarship and science are going to be affected in the West in a way that's going to hurt everyone, hurt our health, welfare, economic vitality. Because let's face it, it's science that's at the basis of all of that.
To the extent your war on science metaphor is apt, isn't it really a two-front war? And the biggest front right now is the U.S. Health Secretary, who is a conspiracy theorist who is trying to discredit vaccines, which save millions of lives every year. In terms of actual human life and the threat to human safety, all the examples we've been talking about, and there's many more examples in the book, which people should read. Great chapter on anthropology by Elizabeth Weiss, which is particularly good. It was written for Quillette. I think these are important, and they're especially important for academics. But in terms of ordinary people and the quality of their life and the protection of their life, what's happening now in the Trump administration and their attack on vaccine science, surely that's the most important front in the war on science right now, no?
There are many fronts in the war on science. So the question is, if you're fighting a war, do you say, okay, well, that's a big front, but I'm going to ignore this one?
But that's the one where people die. Like, people aren't dying because some liberal arts college is hiring the wrong kind of biologist, right?
No, that's not true. Read the chapters by Sally Satel and other people about what's going on in the medical establishment. And or hey, take this. This is 2025, not 2021. Take CanMeds in Canada in 2025. That's the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons developed a new project for medical education. Okay, here's what they argue, and it mirrors what's going on in the United States, talking about people dying. A new model of CanMeds would seek to center values, this is in medical education, seek to center values such as anti-oppression, anti-racism, and social justice rather than medical expertise.
Okay, that's idiotic. But do you think rank and file doctors are listening to that nonsense?
Sally talks about this in her piece and in a recent public event we did. During COVID, hospitals were thinking who should be prioritized in terms of vaccinations and care. And you might think it's the elderly, right? In fact, that is the answer. The problem was, however, that there are more white old people than black old people. And therefore, it was decided that they should not prioritize the elderly, but rather they should prioritize marginalized groups like black people. Now, that's killing people. That's killing people. And so that kind of anti-scientific attitude is killing people. And this kind of stuff, you're absolutely right. Right now, there is a front. But if we undermine science now, then many more people who could have been saved in the next generation are going to die. The point about science is it's slow and the impacts are slow. And our modern GNP is dependent upon curiosity-driven research 25 to 50 years ago. If we undermine the fundamental process by which science is done, not only, and also ensure that the next discoverer of a cure can't get a job because he happens to be white and male or Asian. And I think Dorian Abbott talks about that, in his hypothetical examples in the book. Then in the long run, we're going to kill people. But I agree with you. Absolutely, right now, science is being decimated in the United States, much more than just your vaccine case, not RFK. By cutting grants and cutting major scientific programs, people don't realize if you cut a person's grant like that, and I have colleagues of mine at Harvard who were fantastic scientists, and no matter what, Harvard was anti-Semitic and discriminated against whites and Asians in their student admissions policy. All that's true, but it was still one of the greatest research institutions in the world, and there was great science going on. And I have a lot of great colleagues who are there who then tell me for the first time in 40 years their grants are cut. Well, if you're a theorist, it's one thing, but if you have a laboratory, so your grant cut, what does that mean? The first people to go are the postdocs you brought in from other countries who've moved with their families, who now have to find a job somewhere. And then you can't fund your graduate students. So they're the ones doing the lab work. And so what you have to do is close down your lab. And it's not so easy to start it up again, because then you try and how easy is it to recruit people if they worry that they're going to arrive and not be there. And so this has a long tail, and it is devastating. But let's remember that this book was finished in late October 2024. So we can't be completely prescient about what was going to go on in 2025. I did add, and several other authors, notes in press about indicating that, hey, there's other problems going on. Neil Ferguson writes a piece in here, a very interesting piece about what happened in Nazi Germany, and how the best universities in the world, which were Heidelberg and Berlin, Robert Oppenheimer, anyone who in physics had to go to Germany. Okay, this was as early as 1930s, 32. By 1940, they had no universities. Okay, and this can happen. And I really do think that if the scientific infrastructure of in the United States is attacked at that kind of level, because why? Because it's assumed that all scientists are woke. I mean, it's probably also assumed because Donald Trump, couldn't get into school he wanted to, or God knows what that madman is causing him to think and act. But a lot of it is because they're assuming that the universities are lost. And I even have, in fact, there's an author here who I disagree with in the book who constantly tells me he thinks you just have to burn the whole thing down. There's no solution. I totally disagree with him.
Not the answer.
Well, I won't tell you who it is afterwards. I will. But so this has caused that reaction, right? This has caused that reaction. And it is hurting in the near term, hurting science far more immediately, and may have a dramatic impact. And I think what you're going to see is, and you already see people moving out of the United States, some of them to Canada, although Canada in many ways is worse.
Lawrence Krauss, thank you so much for joining the Quillette podcast. It's my turn to hold up your book, The War on Science. With the holidays coming up, I can't think of a finer gift idea. Thanks so much. And glad to hear you move back to Canada.
Thanks, John. It's always good to talk to you. You take care.